Welcome. We have an interesting panel coming up for you, and kind of moving a little from kind of traditional views of computer security and looking at some other issues. Fairness, which actually has a lot in common with data privacy, and trustworthiness in AI, which trust is something we think of a lot in computer security. Trustworthy AI, some relationships, some differences. So I'm going to just go through a couple of things before I introduce the panel. What's the problem here? Well, there's a lot of concerns about fairness, trustworthiness of AI systems. Fairness, AI systems exhibit recognizable biases. Amazon created a resume screener that was showing gender bias. There's software being used to predict recidivism and that is being used in setting bail, for example, that is showing racial biases. Various types of biases here. And trustworthiness. AI systems, we know, can get it wrong. And sometimes they get it wrong in ways that humans would perfectly succeed. Many of you have seen the example of taking a stop sign, putting a few stickers on it, and all of a sudden the AI system thinks it's a speed limit sign. There's some problems here. Context of this, well, trustworthiness has long been an issue in cybersecurity, particularly in safety critical systems. Fairness and privacy turn out to have a lot in relation. This fairness, a lot of the work and the concern in AI has largely been in traditional civil rights spaces and those types of issues. But are there other issues? Trustworthiness, again, has been primarily in safety critical systems, use of AI in safety critical systems, particularly autonomous vehicles. The use of AI in autonomous vehicles has generated a lot of safety concerns. So, but there's a couple of things to think about, like, are fair and trusted AI kind of independent concepts? Do they really, are they really together? We may get into some of that as we go into this, panel. But let me start by introducing the panelists. For those who don't know me, I'm Chris Clifton. I'm on the faculty here at Purdue. I've been part of CERIAS for over 20 years now. And actually, I think my first interaction with CERIAS was in the previous millennium. So it's been a while. Also with us, we have a distinguished panel of people, all of whom have Purdue connections. Tom Gruenwald, who is a senior vice president with Blue Waves AI, got his PhD here at Purdue in 1976. 2007 was named an outstanding alum. Has a long history, including faculty, University of Portland, Bell Labs, Tel Labs, Spectrum Control, Westall. I'll let you go into a little on kind of your thoughts on these fairness, trustworthiness issues and why this interests you.
Okay, thank you. Our company, Blue Wave AI Labs, generates software, makes software that's used in the nuclear industry as well as defense. We do some work for DARPA as well. And trustworthiness comes in a little different flavor with respect to nuclear, because the folks who use our software are using it to plan how they're going to operate the reactor for the next 2 years. So we have to do a really thorough job of showing them that the software, the predictions are really accurate and trustworthy. And sometimes it's good to step back and ask yourself, okay, what is AI? Because AI is one of those words that can mean a lot of different things. primarily, it's a blanket term for a lot of different techniques. Those of you who were here for the poster session saw that there's an amazing set of talented people who are using AI in a lot of different ways and a lot of different AI techniques. But basically, AI is always supported or a reflection of the data. There are a lot of different techniques, but the data is really what determines how well the quote unquote AI is going to work. And the data is primarily, but not always, what introduces the bias. In our work, we have to make sure that the data that reflects the real way the reactors operate. We take usually 20 years of historical data to train a model to then give predictions. So again, we focus a lot on the data. The other thing we worry about a lot is using the models in the regime that the data describes. It would be as if you were trying to select blue cars, but you've never had a blue car in your training set. There's also the difficulty sometimes with the models because you don't know exactly what the model is going to pick up on. And some of these models, actually the most complicated model in use right now has 1 trillion free parameters that are determined by the training data. And there's a famous problem of an AI that was trying to identify different animals. It had problems with horses. And when they looked into it, they found out that, oh, the AI was training on the copyright that appeared in the horse pictures because the horse pictures that they used to train the AI all had a copyright on them, but nobody else, none of the other pictures did. And so what that leads us to do in order to engender trust with our customers is we do a lot of work, what are called explainability analyses, trying to understand what features actually made the result come true. And then that plus accuracy is what really gives our customers trust in what we do. So it's a little different kind of trust than when you're dealing with people. And I think most folks know that, you know, the Europeans are significantly ahead of us in the whole trust thing. They've got the GDPR, which is about 100-page set of regulations about what you do, what you have to do when you use data that pertains to human beings. So that's sort of my introduction to how we look at trust.
Okay, also with us, we have Ashish Kundu, who is, again, Purdue connections. He's currently head of cybersecurity research at Cisco, but his PhD is from Purdue, computer science in 2010. For those of you tomorrow morning, come to the awards and hear about and hear of some of our awards. Ashish, 11 years ago, was a recipient of the CERIAS Diamond Award. He's previously been at IBM Research and Neuro. Unfortunately, unable to join us in person today, but is with us. So Ashish, I'll let you give a little idea of fairness and trust and how that's of interest to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Clifton, for your kind introduction. And it is a pleasure and honor actually to be part of the CERIAS Symposium again. As an alum, CERIAS and CS alum from Purdue, and I was a student of Professor Clifton. It's also a great honor to be part of the panel where he is moderating. So thank you everyone again. And I think when we look at the important topic of fairness and trustworthiness in AI, right? Let me focus on primarily machine learning instead of going into the general area of AI. When you look at fairness, right, they're more about something relative like civil rights that change from geopolitical region to another region from time to time. Whereas trustworthiness is a close cousin, but that is more related to as as Professor Clifton and Tom pointed out earlier, right, that they're more related to security in some way, in trust. Can you compromise a given machine learning system, a model, or its real-time classification or prediction mechanism in some way that it is going to work in an unintended manner, right? So if you focus on a little more on fair AI, right, it talks about essentially algorithmic bias with respect to certain fairness policies. Maybe that is or regulatory requirement that is developed by a government or certain civil rights body, right? Like pay, and gender equality, your voting rights, for example, or hiring decisions, right? But there is a general from my point of view, there's a general problem there that when we talk about fairness in machine learning systems, are we trying to make it fairer than what is in the world today, right? Or are we trying to match the fairness of the fairness that we have in the world today, or we plan to have in next few years? And that is where comes the problem of are we developing machine learning systems for this world or another world that is in the future? And in that context, what does fairness of AI means in metaverse? Okay, that's something I'm currently working on to write a paper about what does it mean in fairness and ethics of AI in metaverse, of the avatars and other things. Right? So and then there's some work that has been carried out there. There are fairness metrics very well studied from the statistical standpoint. There are so from a trustworthy point of view, the challenges are essentially can the model be compromised, right? Is it compromised? What are the cyber physical safety issues, right? What does adversarial machine learning play a role? How does it play a role in trustworthiness? Now, can adversarial machine learning contribute to unfairness, okay, or fairness in machine learning systems? That is where they can they overlap with each other, right? To give an example, right? Imagine a map service, right? That one can use on the drive, and that map service is going to give directions to improve cells of an EV charging station, electronic battery charging station of the car, right? It's going to change it, increase your distance or whatever, right? Will you call it trusted ML or untrusted ML or unfair ML? Let me pause here, and then we can come back to that later. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashish. And our other two panelists are currently affiliated with Purdue, and I've had the honor of working with both of them on a project funded by NSF and Amazon on fairness in AI. Lindsay Weinberg is an assistant professor in the Honors College, and I think has a history of kind of working cross-disciplinary, just like being in an honors college, which is kind of deals with multiple disciplines. Her PhD from UC Santa Cruz was in history of consciousness. She has the director, I think founding director is the correct word for this, of the Tech Justice Lab here at Purdue. So let me turn it over to Lindsay.
Can you folks hear me okay? Is this all right for folks in the back? Is that good? Okay, awesome. Thank you all so much for inviting me to speak with you. I always love the opportunity to talk across disciplines, and I'm of course honored to be up here with two of my colleagues on the grant that I'm on, precisely on this idea of AI fairness. So I guess I'll just try and be very, very quick about how I approach AI fairness as a feminist researcher. And I think what my training in feminist studies has taught me to think about is how do we center questions of power, and how do we think about the experiences of folks who are the most marginalized oftentimes in these conversations, both in terms of who gets to participate in AI research, who is most disparately impacted by AI systems, whose voices and experiences tend to be left out of these discussions, and really kind of immersing myself in those community experiences. So I think there's a few ways we can start asking questions about AI fairness. You know, how do assumptions about what it means for a system to be fair get baked into these kinds of conversations? To what extent are impacted communities at the table and able to give their input into exactly when we should decide an AI system is actually the best solution to a given problem? And I actually think there's two dominant ways in which AI fairness discourse actually perpetuates harm. You know, oftentimes we think of aspirations for AI fairness as achieving greater equality or greater fairness in society. But I want to give you two examples to think about that I think help maybe temper claims that algorithmic fairness is something that we should always aspire to. So one example might be facial recognition technology, right? This is a technology with known racial and gender bias. And within kind of conventional AI fairness thinking, we might say, okay, let's solve for that racial and gender bias. Let's make sure that facial recognition technology works equally well across all racial and gender groups, right? The problem with that type of approach to AI fairness is that when something like facial recognition technology is used to optimize the existing criminal legal system, and that existing criminal legal system tends to mass incarcerate folks of color, do we really want that system to be able to more accurately read folks of color's faces, right? And when you listen to communities on the ground, when you listen to communities of color doing activism work around the prison industrial complex, they don't necessarily want to be more legible to facial recognition technology. And yet within the discourse around aspirations to algorithmic fairness, we would assume that making FRT fairer would be a positive outcome, right? Just to give you one other example for thinking about this, and this is a case study that Dr. Clifton had brought up. You know, Compass is an algorithm that's used to help inform judges' decisions about the likelihood that a defendant will become a repeat offender, right? So it's meant to guide judges in making these really difficult decisions. It's purportedly a more accurate tool because it's based on, you know, historical data patterns, right? And yet we know that folks of color are disproportionately targeted within the prison industrial complex, right? So we also see that these decisions can optimize those existing biases. If we were to fix Compass, right? If we were to make sure that Compass is equally predictively accurate for all racial and ethnic groups, would that be a fairer tool? And I think what folks on the ground might say is you're still optimizing a system that seeks to put folks in jail, right? You're still thinking about a problem formulation space where justice is conceived of how do we incarcerate people more fairly, right? And there's other ways to imagine a society of thinking about justice, thinking about what do we do with people who commit harms in society that aren't rooted in mass incarceration, right? Lots of folks make other kinds of arguments for ways we might solve these problems. And yet the problem formulation space within the dominant discourse is how do we optimize the status quo? How do we optimize this Compass technology to be fair, right? So my discipline teaches me to kind of interrogate the kinds of epistemological assumptions we make about what AI fairness even means, right? And to maybe take a step back from those discourses.
Thank you. And our final panelist is Christopher Yeomans, who is professor and head of the Department of Philosophy here at Purdue. Obtained his PhD in Riverside, UC Riverside. So we have two people from UC, two people from Purdue, and the oddball here. And and Christopher's also had the experience of being a Humboldt Fellow, where he spent time at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. That was in 2016. So I'll let you go ahead and give an idea of some of the things you're doing in fairness here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe I'll also speak a little to the disciplinary background. So philosophers spend a lot of time thinking about what you might call natural intelligence, right? The kind of intelligence that we all seem to have or lack, as the case may be, on any given day. Spoiler alert, the result is it's really complicated. So part of my interest in AI generally is wondering how any of this could be built from the ground up, right? And trying to see what insights might be derived from trying to do it that way, the kinds of modeling that are involved, but with a heavy dose of, I think, realism about the complexity and context sensitivity of all sorts of human judgments, whether epistemic or normative judgments, that is, judgments about what is the case or judgments about what ought to be the case. And so even within philosophy, I think I am on a continuum of people. I'm on one end thinking that in particular, our normative judgments, our moral and our political judgments are incredibly complicated. They're very context sensitive. I'm a value pluralist. I don't think that our moral or political values are reducible to freedom or equality or one single value. I think we always have values that are trading off against each other, and that there's no equation for what the right trade-off is, particularly in any given situation. To come to fairness in particular, I think it's notable that of all of the sort of terms for normative rightness that we have, like if you put fair up against just, good, right, moral, I think fair, at least in English, is the most context sensitive and the most local of all of those terms, and the most likely to be tied to particular decisions in particular contexts. And that raises particular issues of complexity for any attempt to automate this or to explain what an automated system has done with it. So anyway, those are sort of my expectations of what artificial intelligence will look like from thinking about what natural intelligence will look like. I do think that there's an upside there, which is I do think sometimes people in the AI community think you won't have found fair AI until you can eliminate disagreement about the decisions that are being made. But let me tell you, that's a fool's errand, right? You're not going to eliminate that kind of disagreement. And it's more important to understand the quality of the disagreement. And it's more important to understand the different groups and the different perspectives and the different interests that are involved in the disagreement, and getting those people talking to each other about how, as Ashish put it, to make it fairer, right? That's the goal. Right. Right. So maybe I'll just stop there.
Well, I'll tell you, we've had some discussions amongst ourselves, email discussions, and came up with a few questions. And so I'm going to pose those and to get things started. But as we go on, if you've got questions to add or things you want to pose to the panelists, things you want to add, please step up to the mic. I'd like this to be a discussion. I'm going to start off with the first, and this kind of builds on something Ashish talked about in trustworthiness, which is, how much do we really need? What about fairness? Why should we care that AI is fair, even if humans aren't fair? And Ashish, I'm going to put you on the spot to start this off. Oh, there we are.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we're good.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Clifton. So, yeah. So why do we need AI to be fair, right? So if we look at how machine learning models or machine learning systems work, right? They are data driven primarily. They are not a implementation of a deterministic algorithm that is being used there, and it's going to be totally context independent. So machine learning models are highly context sensitive, and dependent on the data. They're number one, the data that is being used for training. Number two, the way the training is carried out. It's like there are work ongoing on determining, even for the same type of data, are there any other variables that affect how the models behave, right? Then there are hyperparameter tuning, so the weights are important aspects of how the model will behave later, even after training, right? So those are different aspects. And then there are aspects of at the runtime when the model is, let's say, is based on TensorFlow, right? And you are going to run it on NVIDIA GPUs, for example, right? But if there are the model doesn't execute properly, right? Or there are certain other issues with respect to the runtime, maybe we are looking at that the AI may not be acting in a fair manner. Maybe the runtime is not fair itself. The model may be trained to be fair. So there is a necessity for looking at fairness of AI, not just from algorithmic point of view, not just from data bias, which the industry has been looking at or the academia has been looking at. They have to look at the entire life cycle of the model governance, or AI governance, and try to see where fairness can be crept in. That is where key threats to fairness might come in, and fairness could also lead to privacy disclosures. So there is a strong overlap between, as you know, civil rights, privacy, and everything. Similarly, AI fairness and privacy is also there, and that is why we need to have explainability. And as Tom pointed out earlier, we need to determine what bias means, what are the latent bias, what are the explicit and implicit bias in the data or in the systems, and perhaps improve the fairness metrics that we have from just statistical properties to properties with respect to computing or runtime related properties. So I think those are different aspects that we need to address, and governance is important there, and regulatory compliance. Last point I'd like to bring out is that perhaps this is where the government and the federal machinery should come up with regulatory requirements on what it means by AI fairness. That is for only US. Then state to state fairness would change. Geopolitical fairness would change over time. And if there are the war is going on right now, right? The Ukraine invasion. What do we mean by fairness there? There are drones that is being used. There could be perhaps robots on the ground, right? Are they being teleoperated remotely? Okay. Are they being operated semi-autonomously, or are there autonomous weapons? Right? So all those things bring out the question is, are they going to target civilians, or are they going to target only military targets? So let me pause here and see if there are other questions or thoughts.
And we also want to pick up on this of, why do we care that AI is fair?
I guess I would say we care that AI is fair for the same reasons we care about people being treated unfairly. We try not to tolerate that. And I know in Europe, they've got this data, in a sense, Bill of Rights. And if a machine makes a decision about you in Europe, you at least have the right to know how that machine made that decision and that actually happened. And so it's sort of like you would in an ordinary situation where you're just dealing with people. You have recourse. If somebody denied you for a loan, you can pick up the phone and say, hey, tell me why I got denied so I can do something about it. And I think at the lowest level of fairness, AI ought to be constructed so that there's at least a recourse and a reason given.
Maybe I just follow. I was going to say in part the same thing. AI should be fair because people should be treated well.
Yeah.
Right. Because that there's an additional reason, I think, which is AI applications are promising when at scale, right? When you've got massive data sets and you're trying to get a lot of information to make a lot of decisions consistently. Right. That's, I think, the great promise of AI really is in crunching through that sort of thing and making those sorts of decisions at scale. decisions made at scale are precisely the sort of thing in human institutions that are hardest to explain, that are hardest to make transparent, and that are most likely to seem alienating to people, even if you explain it at length, right? I mean, so even human reasoning at scale can be very alienating. Think about a Supreme Court decision. These are the best reasoners in the world. They'll spend a couple of 100 pages explaining a decision. And it doesn't stop the disagreement, right? It doesn't stop the sense of alienation and so on. But you can mitigate in that some way. And I think the institutions that are going to be using AI applications to make these decisions at scale, a lot of their legitimacy rests on at least having a commitment to making things fairer, right? Or more transparent, even though you have this scale that is inevitably going to lead to a kind of sorts of doubts, right? And alienation.
I guess I can
follow up on
quickly
this?
add, thinking about what you folks are sharing, is how often I see a gap between transparency and accountability. So it's one thing for an institution or an AI designer to explain every decision they made, where the provenance of that data set was from, and walk a person through exactly how that system was constructed and how decisions were made. But transparency in and of itself doesn't guarantee that that person is then empowered to say, hey, I don't feel like that decision about me was actually fair. I don't feel like that decision about me was right, or even if it is right, that I don't think that system is actually how we should go about making judgments as a society. I think the simplest example of this that comes to mind is privacy policies, right? Like you can imagine a company that has a really transparent, really good privacy policy, but if you need access to that platform, if you need access to that service in order to apply for a job, I mean, do you really have a meaningful option to opt out of that system? So I think it's always useful to link transparency and accountability, and if you have one without the other, it can actually shore up power for institutions as opposed to being a meaningful check and balance.
Interesting. Lindsay, you brought up this question or this term AI justice as opposed to fairness. Would you care to elaborate? Is there a difference between AI justice and AI fairness?
Yeah, I'll try and be quick because I'm so curious to hear what the other folks to my right think. I do think there's a distinction, and I think there's a distinction for a few reasons. So I think that the terms fairness and justice have different genealogies in terms of how I see them come up. AI fairness, I think when you historicize this aspiration for it within institutions, it comes from this earlier period of actuarial risk and insurance institutions historically trying to make decisions about who should be entitled to certain access to goods and resources and opportunities. And then when we look at AI fairness discourse today, it oftentimes takes these very mathematical parity-based metrics coming out of civil rights era legislation. And there's been a tremendous amount of scholarship that has been critical of ideas of fairness within civil rights discourse. And yet none of those criticisms have really been incorporated and attended to the ways AI fairness is being treated today, right? So I think that there's a way in which AI fairness discussions are relying on this very computational, quantitative-based approach that's grounded in statistical decision-making that's been criticized outside the field, and it hasn't really attended to those criticisms. I think AI justice has not received that type of treatment. I don't think it's been co-opted institutionally in the same kinds of ways. And I think justice has a different genealogical lineage as well. When we talk about justice, we have to talk about racial justice or social justice or environmental justice. It connects to a different set of intellectual traditions that I think provide more critical frameworks. And I think justice makes us ask questions about power. It makes us ask questions about who's included. It makes us ask questions about resources and advantages and disadvantages in a way that I don't think AI fairness necessarily provokes us to do.
Do you want to? You look like you're ready to speak up on that.
Sure. No.
I
I got lots to say too. I think in one sense, I agree with Lindsay. In one sense, I disagree. So I also want to divide the concepts of fairness and justice. I do that. And in fact, at first, it really puzzled me why we use the term fair, why that came to be the term that we use to talk about AI. It's not really a technical term in philosophy. In philosophy, we read lots of books about justice, about equality, about freedom. We don't really write a lot of books about fairness, actually. It tends to be treated as a kind of low budget, parochial notion, right? Yeah, I've come to think of that as actually a feature rather than a bug when we're talking about AI, because I think a lot of AI decisions can be evaluated along one axis in precisely that way, right? But that does precisely leave aside questions of justice, which I do think of as somewhat different. Where I would disagree is, I guess I want to think about justice as bigger questions about larger institutions in which AI decisions are embedded, right? So in a way, I think AI fairness is a good question. I don't think AI justice is a good question, but I think the justice of the penal system is a great question, or the justice of capitalism is a good question, or something like that. But I would want to use justice and that set of normative questions for the kind of bigger framework issues in which AI decisions are necessarily going to be embedded. Right now, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be an interesting interaction between the two, I think.
Ashish, did you want to speak up?
Yeah, I just one comment. It's a very nice discussion about AI justice and from Lindsay and Chris, right? So if you look at autonomous driving, that is your AI justice actually makes a lot of sense. That if there is a liability, there is a crash, who is liable for that? Is the self-driving system on it, or is the passenger or the driver on the wheel but is not driving that, or the other person's, right? So I think there's a lot of questions, and can you really trust, the trustworthiness comes. Can you trust the explainability of the AI system, say that, hey, this is why I crashed it, what Tesla is telling, and this is why my car crashed. So I think AI justice is a good thing, good concept to follow up on.
Yeah. So here's another. How is fairness related to AI ethics? And let me get Christopher up, for our philosopher up for that.
Yeah. So philosophers use ethics very broadly, right? Generally, we tend to use ethics as the giant grab bag in which almost all sorts of normative questions fall. Maybe not aesthetic questions, if you think aesthetic questions are normative questions, but questions of political justice, questions of individual virtue, questions of moral responsibility, and so on. So I guess I think of fairness as one of the ethical dimensions along which we can evaluate really anything at all. But I think particularly when we're talking about fairness, and maybe this will be one additional thing that I'll say is, I think generally speaking, when we're talking about fairness, we're not talking about an individual decision at an individual time. We're talking about repeated decisions over time. Right? When, for example, in families or in academic departments, people start to feel like things are unfair. It's not generally because something went against them one time. They feel like it always goes against them, right? If people feel like, well, I lost this one, but I won the next one, people don't start to feel like the decisions being made are unfair. Or if people feel like they're being heard, and then the next time, right, they get some influence or something like that. So I think fairness really points to these iterated decision-making processes. And so within ethics, if we're asking about fairness, I think that's really focusing our concern on the historical pattern of these decision-making or the decisions that are being made, made, which is why, for example, in Compass, right, if it had been a situation where African Americans felt like they were getting a great fair shake from the criminal justice system before the AI, and then all of a sudden there was this bug with the AI, that would have been a very different situation than feeling like, oh, this is just a continuation of the same problem, right? So I think fairness, fairness focuses our attention on these historical decisions. I think justice focuses our attention on structures and structural relationships. I think equality focuses our attention on what you might call second personal relationships, right? Where I stand with relation to you and so on. So I think all of these different normative terms within ethics are like different perspectives that you can pick up to evaluate the phenomenon that you're trying to that you're interested in. And so that's why I think there's a real value in distinguishing fairness and justice, because they get at these different things, and we should be thinking about both of them.
Anybody else want to chime in on this?
I'll add a little
Ethics.
wrinkle, not to
Yeah.
that specific discussion, but when it came to fairness and justice with respect to AI, there are generally two types of AI systems. Some of them are autonomous and some have human in the loop. And I think the thing that scares most people are the totally autonomous systems where there's no recourse. It's just going to do what it's going to do. And at least with human in the loop, the AI system is advising a human who will make the final decision. Now, I'm not sure where that goes with respect to fairness and justice, but I think there is a distinction there that is pretty important, because if I have a biased AI system and there's a human in the loop, hopefully that person might be able to recognize the cases where it's bad. But if it's completely autonomous, whether it's a weapon or it's just institutional decisions, that's when things get a little worse, I think, a little more scary.
Anybody else want to? Let me, I see time's getting short and we've got a lot we still want to discuss. Oh, we have a question here. Yes.
So I have a question about how much of this is to do with the AI versus our expectations of it. And I want to point to an example of a paper that I wrote in 1999. Remember that? It was called What's Related? Everything But Your Privacy. And it was a dissection of a button that showed up in the Netscape Communicator version 4 browser. No explanation, but there was a thing up there next to your URL that would have a button that said, what's related? And if you clicked on it, then it would show you a list of pages that Alexa decided were related. When you would click on that button, when looking at my paper describing the what's related button and the privacy implications and the consequences of that technology, it said the #1 related thing was the Unabomber manifesto. Now, of course, I was outraged, but at the same time, it's a no-brainer. The Unabomber was warning about technology runaway, so you could see how it would be related. But of course, then somebody looks at this, and now here I show up. I'm putting my hand up in court. I'm being sworn in and all this, and now the other side is trying to destroy me by saying that, well, aren't you related to the Unabomber? So is this an expectations problem, and is it any better today than it was 23 years ago?
I want to read the papers.
I'll maybe say one thing about this. This is give me a minute. So historical analogy, right? 18th century Prussia, Frederick the Great pushes out the Preußische Allgemeines, the Prussian General Code, right? Why does he do this? Because he hates lawyers. And he thinks if you can just write the law out clearly everybody will see what it is, and we won't need lawyers anymore, right? They'll go into something more productive, right? That's sometimes, I think, the kind of expectation we have about AI, that if we just get the coding right, the disagreements would go away, right? And then we could all be more productive. But I don't think there's any better chance that AI will make the disagreements go away than a properly written legal code will make lawyers go away.
Yeah, I might want to just add one thing to that. When we were talking about ethics and fairness, it's also culturally a little different. And I'll give you a quick example. When I was working for Tell Labs, I was in charge of human resources, and we had this grand idea that we would have a Tell Labs code of ethics. So I went to Finland, where we had 1,100 people working, and I said, we're going to give you this code of ethics. And you would think they'd all be okay with it. They said, this is outrageous. We behave like this anyway. Why do you have to write it down and tell us? And the other thing was that was, maybe a little more stark. We decided that every employee would get stock options. So we went to Finland and we said, you're all going to get stock options. Even the janitor and anybody is going to get a stock option. They said, you're already paying us. We don't want stock options. So it was pretty interesting just to see their sense of fairness was different than ours, but it made no sense at first to us until we kind of got to know how their culture operated.
Well,
I think
kind of on fairness, let me bring up did you?
No, I just saw that.
Oh, we
person was
have,
waiting, yeah, in case there's
I'm-
time.
I'll just add one,
No worries,
one
no worries.
point to the question.
I'd like to, anybody would comment, but I'd like to direct the question to Tom. Your corporation, the company that you're heading right now, its core technology is very AI based and used for business things. Can you talk from the commercial side of some of the challenges that you deal with in making sure that the services that you're providing to your customers, that I am making assumptions that you're showing them how it can help them with business. But obviously underlying is that sometimes the customer's concerned, sometimes maybe they're not concerned, but your company obviously has to deal with these fairness and trusted AI implications of your product. How do you deal with this in the commercial space?
Without getting into too much detail, there's a whole process that covers almost everything that this conference covers. It starts with data privacy. We have to ensure them that we are storing their data in a secure place which has encryption, et cetera, that the data is encrypted in flight, et cetera, and that only the folks in our company that need to use that data can see it. Now, as an aside, the data makes absolutely no sense to anybody, but they're concerned. Okay, so we do that. Then we have a pretty intense discourse with them about what the data means, what data might be corrupt, et cetera, and then we go to the modeling portion where we have a pretty rigorous. I mean, it takes 5 or 6 months of developing the models, testing them under every circumstance, finding out where the model doesn't work, and then doing various types of analyses that allow us to understand what features are driving the model, and even to get down to the level of what features are driving the model in certain parts of the reactor, because that allows them to take remedial action if they have to. So it's a process of continued analysis, understanding, and then once we deploy the model to them, what they do is there's a human in the loop. Their engineers use our software to do planning, where they say, okay, how many bundles of fuel do we need to buy? What kind will it be, et cetera? And then the system tells them what that's going to do within the reactor. And then once that happens, we'll take any new data they give us and test it against what the model predicted. So it's a process of a lot of testing and a lot of deep analysis past the point where we just give them a black box model. Does that answer your question? I think. Okay.
Something surprised you somewhere along the
Well, things constantly, yeah. Yeah, things surprise us often because sometimes they don't tell us everything. Like, for instance, we did this model that calculated how much energy they would get out of their fuel. And they said, oh, by the way, we changed our measuring system 10 years ago. So half the data you have is off by 20%. Well, that explained why we were concerned about our answer. And so it's a constant kind of making sure things make sense. It's not specifically a fairness thing. It's more of a trust thing where understanding and accuracy leads to trust.
Just to continue with that, trustworthiness, should we, what does it mean to be trustworthy? Why do we care? Is it enough to be just better than what we had before? Or is that not good enough?
Well, I think that trustworthiness has a different level of, or a slightly different meaning when you're dealing with people than when you're dealing with machines. Because, if we make a mistake, somebody's going to lose $100,000. If a machine makes a mistake about a person, they're going to lose the opportunity to buy a house or a car, or maybe even something worse is going to happen to them. So I think trust in an industrial quote setting is a little different than trust in a where an AI is making decisions about human beings.
What about in your context? So is that, if you go and say, our predictions are going to be better than what you had before, shouldn't that be good enough?
Well, it's good enough is never good enough, and that's actually what we do. We constantly try to improve the accuracy and the certainty with which these predictions are made. Generally, that depends on having more data. I mean, we talk a lot about fancy AI models and this and that, but ultimately, 95% of the battle is, do you have the right data and if you interpret it correctly?
If I could, Chris,
Yes.
I think this is such an interesting example. And I wanted to bring in back the question of power. And I think when you talk about AI trustworthiness, I think it's an interesting question, like whose trust are you trying to earn? And who are the stakeholders that you're trying to appeal to? And I think even thinking about nuclear power, right, when you think about uranium mining and you think about other communities that are perhaps not the folks you need to interact with on a daily basis, but thinking about Ashish's point about the entire life cycle of a model, or the entire life cycle of a system, are there stakeholders or are there folks who might feel like their measure of a system's trustworthiness is going to be very different than perhaps the different stakeholders? But who are the people that we're actually asking whether or not they find the system trustworthy or not, is a question that I find myself returning to.
And
we're mainly asking the people who use the system and who manage the whole energy process. And one of the outcomes of the things that we do is they do get to use less fuel, which means there's less waste, which means there's less of a problem downstream in storing that waste. But no, we don't interact with the uranium miners, although we do interact a lot with the green energy community who, the whole idea of reducing CO2 emissions. And from that perspective, they tend to they're at least interested in what we're doing, if not giving us their trust.
I think to add to this discussion, about the stakeholders, and Lindsay pointed out, there's a great point that is where I was coming for about use of decentralized trust, that we are actually ready to adopt the concept of decentralized trust in AI governance for trustworthiness of AI. And there are certain startups are there of using blockchain for AI fairness and AI trustworthiness. And also I'll connect that to something called supply chain of fairness, or supply chain of trust in AI aspects. Because when you talk about this, the nuclear waste and related stakeholders, right? How does the supply chain look like, and what does the related responsibilities lie there? decision making, as well as in making sure that it is sustainable and it is the right decision to make.
So anyone else on that? What about, we've talked about these safety critical systems for trust, autonomous vehicles, nuclear power plants. Where else? I mean, we have things that really aren't kind of these safety critical, that, something goes wrong and people die, where we still need this trustworthiness from our AI? Or are there areas where AI trustworthiness maybe isn't a big issue? Any?
So I'll just
Ashish,
add quickly.
you've got
Yeah, I'll
some.
just add quickly. There's a lot of work going on in healthcare. One is about drug discovery, right? So drug discovery is an area. Personalized treatment is an area where AI trustworthiness is extremely important, because personalized treatment, where you want to make sure that it is fair to everybody. It's not treating someone in an unfair manner, but it is also trusted, that it's not going to actually recommend a drug to someone or a group of individuals because the system has been compromised through data poisoning attacks or through model poisoning or something, right? And this is where we need to see both fairness and trustworthy, how they can play together.
Anybody else? Thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I'll just say, I think in any situation in which an AI application is making a decision or substantially influencing a decision, trust and fairness are going to be important, right? Because any decision is going to involve a distribution of costs and benefits, responsibilities, and so on. And even if there aren't, strictly speaking, winners and losers for that kind of a decision, there's still going to be people who wanted it to go a different way and people who wanted it to go that way. And as long as it's involved in those sorts of decisions, the long-term legitimacy of whatever institution is using the AI application to make those decisions is at stake, and the treatment of people within those institutions is at stake, I think.
Well, I mean, we're getting close to time, so I'm going to start off with kind of a final question for each of the panelists to what do you see as the greatest threat or barrier to fair or trustworthiness or justice in AI? So let's start here with Lindsay.
Sure. So I guess I'd name a few things. I think the first for me is a lack of interdisciplinarity in general. And I think the way that folks who are trained to build AI systems, they're not necessarily required to talk to folks with domain expertise from outside the field. Ethics isn't rigorously incorporated into the education of a lot of folks who end up building AI systems. I think that's another reform that I could imagine. I also think, for me personally, I do believe that diversifying who gets to participate in the development of these systems, and also giving folks who are oftentimes the most severely and disparately impacted more agency, more power, more control at all stages of the AI life cycle. I think that those type of changes would get us move the needle in significant kinds of ways. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Expectations, right? And it's connected to some of the things Lindsay just said. Thinking that AI, the successful AI, will somehow be an end run around human complexity. And that's not going to happen. It's going to be a certain kind of participation in human complexity, and it can be an improvement of that kind of complexity, but it is not going to be an end run around it, nor should it attempt to do so.
I think, the biggest threat, I do think it's also expectations. I think there's a level of misconception about AI. I mean, they're very bright people who think that the Terminator is going to come here from the future. It's really not that capable. I mean, at least now and for the foreseeable future, it's a really, really excellent calculator. And that's the way, our team is. Our team is all engineers who understand the systems that they're working on, who use AI as a tool. But in my realm, the biggest threat to AI is just data, understanding data and using it correctly, and understanding where the data isn't really going to give you a result that is applicable in another regime that you want it to be applicable in. So my experience is kind of, in a sense, limited. We don't deal with autonomous systems, et cetera.
Ashish.
So I think one of the important barrier is actually the data. To agree with Tom, is that the way data is collected, curated, and used for training, testing, validation, whatnot, right? And that is also is a complicated issue when we bring in regulatory compliance like GDPR, HIPAA, etc. into play. That creates data islands, So, and when we build models in one data island and then try to reuse it in another data island, and that is going to cause concern about fairness as well as trustworthiness. The second one is actually bringing regulatory compliance. While we are talking regulatory compliance, not helping AI fairness and trustworthiness, but regulatory compliance should be there. Standardization should be there on how such data is curated and what do we mean by fairness and trustworthiness. And the third one is a decentralized model of fairness and trust that is essential. There are multiple stakeholders. There should not be any centralized authority to work on that. And another work that is ongoing with us at Cisco Research is on responsible AI. We are looking at some of the few of the things here. Thank you.
Well, we're at time here and need to move on to the poster session. So let's thank our panelists. I think this has been wonderful.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah.